No one in Kamuth had seen a lion cross the acacia fence in over 20 years. And yet, on the morning Edwin Odhiambo was speaking his final prayer over an empty grave, one walked straight through the gap and into the center of everything. The savanna grass around Kamutha village had turned silver-white with drought. Not the grass of April rains, not the kind that gives way beneath your feet and springs back, but the brittle, whispering grass of abandonment. The kind that bends under a footstep and never rises again. It was the 3rd week of August, and the acacia trees at the eastern fence line had dropped half their leaves, leaving skeletal branches that scratched at the pale morning sky like fingers trying to hold something already gone. Edwin Odhiambo stood at the center of the gathered village with the stillness of a man who had made a terrible decision and decided it was the right one. He was 61 years old, broad across the shoulders, with hands that had dug wells and carried water, and once, 30 years ago, held his infant son above the surface of the Mara River while the morning light broke gold across both their faces. His voice was measured as he finished the closing verses of the remembrance ceremony, the Luo ritual that seals grief into accepted history, releasing the living to move forward without guilt, without the continuous bleeding of unfinished mourning. "Joseph Kwame Odhiambo," he said, "Son, we release you." 38 villagers stood in the red dust in respectful silence. Several of the elder women hummed softly, eyes closed. 2 of Joseph's childhood friends had their heads bowed so far their chins nearly touched their chests. Nadia Odhiambo stood 20 meters away at the acacia fence line, facing the plains. She was 32. Her father's stubbornness had settled permanently into the line of her jaw. She wore a khaki field shirt with the logo of the Mara Conservation Trust stitched on the chest pocket, and a pair of binoculars hung at her sternum like a second heartbeat. Always ready, always loaded. She had not turned around once during the ceremony. She had refused to attend. Joseph had been missing for 6 weeks. 6 weeks ago, the 9th of July, a Tuesday, her brother had driven a Trust Land Cruiser into the northern grid of the Mara ecosystem to document territorial range shifts in a known male lion. He was 29 years old, 3 months into his first professional field research contract, assigned to follow and GPS log the movements of a scarred territorial male the regional team had given the working name Old Tear, named for the ragged, healed stub where his right ear had once been, and the pale scar that ran from his left temple down across his muzzle like a river channel carved by something edged and ancient. Joseph's last radio check-in came at 6:14 in the evening on the 9th. His vehicle was found 4 days later, overturned in a dry riverbed 8 kilometers northeast of the water tower. Flash flood debris had collected against the chassis. His personal locator beacon had never activated. Search teams from the Trust and the Kenya Wildlife Service worked the terrain for 10 days in expanding grids. They found tire marks. They found the ghost of a flood channel. They found nothing else. On day 18, the KWS formally suspended the active search. Edwin accepted this. He understood loss the way men understand arithmetic, not with feeling, but with the cold accuracy of having done it before. He had grown up in a village where drought took children in clusters, where the plains did not negotiate, and the river did not apologize. He was not cold. He was practical in the particular way of men who have survived devastating things by refusing to look away from them, by staring directly into the loss until it became solid enough to carry. Nadia had not accepted anything. She worked 3 kilometers away at Dr. Mara Whitfield's research camp. Mara was an American wildlife biologist, 47, 19 years in the Rift Valley system, with sun-cracked forearms and a habit of speaking softly and meaning everything she said. Nadia used the camp's radio equipment every dawn, sweeping the frequencies on which Joseph's emergency beacon might still pulse. She had memorized the GPS grid coordinates where his truck was found. She had studied Old Tear's historical range maps until she could reproduce them freehand on the back of a field log. She had driven the northeast boundary roads at dusk and at first light, watching the horizon line. She believed her brother was alive because she had not yet found proof that he was not. Her father believed grief was a door, and the merciful thing was to walk through it so the living could survive. They had not spoken, really spoken, in 2 weeks. The mourning ceremony was nearly concluded when Mama Akinyi raised her arm. She was 74, half-deaf, sharper-eyed than anyone living in Kamutha, and she said nothing when she raised it. She simply pointed toward the eastern gap in the acacia fence, with the composed certainty of a woman who had seen enough in her lifetime to know the difference between what was alarming and what was merely unprecedented. No one had heard the lion approach. He was simply there, the way lions announce themselves when they choose not to announce themselves at all, already present before the mind fully registers the fact. He was large, though age had taken some of the mass from his hindquarters, and the drought had thinned the heavy muscles of his neck. His mane was darkest at the center, fading to a rust brown at the outer edges, matted in several places with old red clay. His right ear was gone, that ragged heeled stub immediately unmistakable. The scar ran from temple to muzzle in a pale ridge that crossed his face like a seam in the earth after something has shifted deep below the surface. Old Tyr. Every elder in Kamuthi recognized that profile without needing to think about it. He had moved in the territory to the northeast for more than a decade, seen occasionally at distance near the water point at dusk, always alone, always sovereign. He was not moving like a lion in threat display. He was not stalking. He was not crouched. He was not scanning for weakness in the crowd. He was walking with the measured, deliberate pace of an animal that has traveled a significant distance and has now arrived exactly where it intended to arrive. In his jaws, carried low, carefully, with the specific gentleness a lion uses when transporting something it does not wish to damage, was a canvas field satchel. It was brown, heavily stained with dried mud and dark water damage. Rectangular, roughly the size of a hardcover book, with a shoulder strap that dragged 2 thin lines through the dust behind him as he walked. The kind of bag a field researcher would carry for equipment, data loggers, sample kits. Standard trust issue canvas. Unambiguous. The silence that descended over the gathering was not the silence of a single reaction. It was the silence of 40 separate minds arriving at the same impossible junction simultaneously, each one stalling at the threshold of what they were being asked to accept. Old men who had lived near lions their entire lives stood with their mouths open. Women who had not stopped humming in 20 years stopped humming. The 2 childhood friends raised their heads. Old Tyr walked to the approximate center of the gathering. He set the satchel down on the red earth with the unhurried precision of an animal that does not possess the capacity for ceremony, but occasionally, inexplicably, produces it. He stepped back once. He sat. His amber eyes moved across the crowd with neither aggression nor particular interest, the gaze of a being that has been alive long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything. Nadia heard the silence from the fence line. Silence has a texture in a village, a specific quality distinct from ordinary quiet, and she had learned to read it the way her brother had learned to read animal behavior, not as an absence of sound, but as the presence of something that had displaced sound entirely. She turned. She saw the lion. She saw the bag. The distance between the fence line and the center of the gathering was perhaps 40 meters. She covered it without being fully aware that her legs were moving. She dropped to her knees in the red dust before the satchel and opened it with both hands. Dr. Mara Whitfield, who had been parked at the camp road's edge reviewing field notes, looked up at the commotion and came across the open ground at a jog, stopping at a careful distance from the lion, her eyes moving between the animal and Nadia on the ground. Inside the bag, a field journal, its pages bloated and fused with dried water damage, but structurally intact. A GPS data logger, cracked screen, battery reading 0, the casing cracked along one corner. A Mara Conservation Trust equipment tag, white laminate over plastic, clearly readable. MDW 2024, Joe 07. A folded square of silver thermal emergency wrap, creased from use, and pressed flat inside the journal's back cover, protected by the rigid binding from the worst of the water damage. A photograph. 4 people. A wedding some years before. Edwin on the left, one arm around his late wife, younger looking than anyone in Kamuthi now remembered him. Nadia on the right, laughing at something off-frame. And Joseph in the center, grinning the way he grinned when something delighted him completely, with his whole body involved, slightly off balance, like the happiness was too large to be contained in just his face. Edwin had pressed that photograph into Joseph's field bag himself, the morning his son left for the survey. "So you remember who was waiting," he had said. He had watched Joseph tuck it into the journal's back cover without ceremony, the way young men accept tokens from their fathers, with affection and mild embarrassment, and no concept of what it might someday cost. Edwin was 4 meters away. He took one step forward, then his legs stopped working. He didn't fall. He simply stopped, standing absolutely still, the photograph shaking slightly in both hands, the closing prayer still hanging in the air around him like ash after a fire has gone cold, his final ritual undone in the space of 30 seconds. His mouth was open and no sound came from it. That was what froze everyone, not the lion, not the canvas satchel, not even the equipment tag with Joseph's research number on it. The sight of Edwin Odhiambo, a man who had stood in the center of loss for 30 years and never once faltered, standing in the center of his village with a photograph in his hands and no language left. Old Tyr withdrew at his own pace. No one moved to follow him. No one made a sound as he turned back toward the acacia gap and walked through it with the same measured, unhurried authority with which he had entered. He did not look back. He disappeared into the tall silver grass as completely as if he had been a question the morning had asked, and then decided not to answer. The next 4 minutes were organized chaos. Dr. Whitfield reached Nadia's side and crouched over the GPS logger with both hands. "The display's dead, but the memory chip may still have data. Even with a failed battery, the last recorded coordinates might be saved. I have the reader at camp." "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe less." Nadia stood and looked at her father. Edwin was still holding the photograph. His face had done something she had never seen it do in her entire life. It had broken open without breaking apart, the way a fault line looks in the earth when the pressure has finally been released. Not destroyed, but rearranged. He looked like a man staring at the cost of a decision he had made with the best information available, and only now understanding what that decision had taken from him. "I need to go to camp," Nadia said. "Wait." His voice came from somewhere underwater. "We don't know what this means yet." "It means he was out there, Baba. It means this bag was inside Old Tyr's territory, which puts Joseph inside Old Tyr's territory, which is a 6-kilometer grid northeast of which is active poacher ground." His voice hardened back into its practical register. It was not cruelty. It was the only armor he had left. "We contact the KWS. We wait for a ranger unit." "We contacted the KWS 6 weeks ago." The words came out of her with more blade than she had intended. She watched him absorb it and did not take it back. They suspended the search. The gathering had gone very quiet around them. No one wanted to be standing inside this conversation, but no one could leave it either. "Nadia," he lowered his voice. "A KWS officer was shot in that northeast grid 11 months ago. You are not driving out there with a dead GPS unit and a biologist. Then come with me." She held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who has been standing at a fence line for 6 weeks, waiting for exactly this moment. "Or don't. But I am not standing here." She picked up Joseph's bag. She walked to Dr. Whitfield's Land Rover without another word, and Whitfield followed. Edwin watched the vehicle pull off the dirt track and onto the northeast road. Old Kamau came and stood beside him. 70 years old, Edwin's oldest friend, a man who had seen enough to know when silence was more useful than wisdom. He said, "You think she's wrong?" Edwin looked at the photograph in his hands. The dust from the Land Rover was already settling. He said nothing. The GPS memory chip gave them a coordinate at 6:23 in the morning, 19 minutes after they arrived at camp. "Doctor." Whitfield read it from the mapping software and placed the pin on the terrain overlay. It dropped into a dry ravine 6.8 kilometers northeast of the water tower. a stretch of terrain that appeared on no active conservation survey because the KWS had classified it as a high-risk zone 2 years ago. No trust team was authorized to enter without armed escort. The only people who moved through it regularly were the ones who had made it dangerous. Whitfield looked at Nadia across the laptop. "That coordinate is 18 days old," Whitfield said carefully. "The seasonal seep in that ravine releases a small water pulse once in August." Nadia was already pulling the keys from the Land Rover's ignition slot. Joseph knew that. It was in his pre-survey ecology notes. He would have known to stay near it. She paused. "He's resourceful. Nadia, if there are active, then we move fast." They were back on the northeast road in 4 minutes. The track deteriorated quickly past the water tower, deep ruts baked into laterite like frozen waves, acacia thorn bush crowding both sides until the track became more suggestion than road. Whitfield drove with both hands high on the wheel. Nadia watched the high ground through the binoculars, scanning the ridge lines. The first snare appeared 600 meters before the ravine. Steel cable looped around a thorn tree set at mid-height for large animals recently retensioned. The anchor knot was still pale against the tree bark where the bark had been freshly compressed. Then a second snare, 40 meters further. Then vehicle tracks pressed into the clay, wide-wheeled, the tread pattern of something heavy, no more than 48 hours old. "Someone has been working this area very recently," Whitfield said. Her voice had gone flat. Nadia lowered the binoculars. She heard the second vehicle before she saw it, an engine behind them on the track, closing distance faster than a vehicle on that road should have been able to. She turned in her seat. It was Edwin's old Hilux, sand-colored, dented along the left panel, moving through the dust cloud his own wheels had raised. Old Kamau was in the passenger seat. 2 of the village's younger men rode in the back, both gripping the roll bar with both hands. Nadia turned back to face the road. She did not speak. She did not allow herself to feel what had just shifted in her chest. Not yet. They parked at the ravine's north lip. The terrain here fell away sharply, a cut in the earth 3 to 4 meters deep in places, the walls dried red clay and shaling loose stone, the floor cracked and white with mineral deposits where the seep water had evaporated weeks ago. The dry season had taken everything. Nadia stepped to the edge and called out. The ravine gave back silence and the sound of her own breath. She cupped her hands to her mouth. Joseph Odhiambo. She used his full name the way their mother had used it, not in anger, but with the specific weight that a full name carries when the person speaking it refuses to pretend that you are anywhere other than exactly where you are. 40 meters east along the ravine floor, something shifted, low, rough at the edges. The voice of a person who has spent their speaking reserves very carefully and is now down to the last of them. But it was a voice. It was his voice. The poacher pit was concealed beneath a camouflage net of woven branches and dried grass, the kind of construction that can be invisible at ground level in a dry landscape where everything has the same color and the same texture of exhaustion. It was roughly 2 meters square and 3 meters deep, originally excavated to trap large predators for illegal trade. Joseph had fallen through the net during the flash flood event on the night of July 9th, when flood debris had buried the netting under 1/2 meter of deposited material, disguising the edge in the dark. He had been inside for 23 days. He was alive because the seasonal seep had released its single August pulse on day 3, a small, low flow that collected in a shallow depression in the corner of the pit floor. Enough to survive on, barely, rationed with the precision of a man who understood he had no margin. He had a broken right ankle from the fall itself. He had used his thermal emergency wrap as a signal mirror on clear days, holding it toward the sky, though no aircraft had passed low enough to catch the reflection. On day 5, he had placed his field satchel on the edge of the pit, balanced carefully on the crumbling clay rim, left open so the scent of the equipment tag and the leather journal bindings could disperse into the air. He knew Old Tier's territorial corridor passed within 300 meters of this ravine. He had documented it himself. He left the bag where any large predator moving through the area might investigate it disturb it, potentially carry it. The same instinctive behavior that drives lions to investigate and sometimes relocate foreign objects found within their range. It was not a plan. It was the last available option of a man who had exhausted all others. It had taken Old Tyr 13 days to move the bag. Edwin heard all of this from the ravine's edge. He was kneeling, listening, his hands braced on the crumbling clay lip, his face lowered toward his son's voice in the dark below. The two young men from the village had already joined the tow straps from both trucks into a single line, 16 meters of capacity, more than enough, and were rigging the anchor around the Hilux's rear tow hook. Edwin stood up. He took the end of the rope from the younger man's hands. The young man, 23, strong, uninjured, looked at him in genuine confusion. Edwin said nothing. He wrapped the strap around both forearms in the climber's grip he had not used since he was 40 years old, set his boots against the clay edge, and descended. 61 years old, a right knee that had been quietly failing for 3 years. Arthritis distributed across both shoulders like something that had moved in and decided to stay. He descended hand over hand, his boots finding narrow purchase in the clay, the weight of his own body trying to take him faster than his arms could manage. The floor of the pit was solid beneath his feet. Joseph was in the far corner. Oh. Thin in the way that a few weeks without enough food makes a young man thin, not dramatically but structurally, as if the body has begun renegotiating its own dimensions. His eyes adjusted slowly to the increased light that arrived with his father. He smelled of earth and mineral water and something older than both. Edwin put both hands on either side of his son's face. He held it the way you hold something you have just realized you almost let go of forever, not tightly, but completely. The way a man holds a thing and finally understands its weight. "Baba," Joseph said. His voice had been in a 3-meter hole for 3 weeks. It came up rough and slow, like something trying to remember how to surface. "I knew you'd come," he whispered. Edwin said nothing, because the truth was complicated, because 3 days ago he had stood in the center of the village and spoken the closing words over an empty grave, because his daughter had been at the fence line every morning for 6 weeks, while he had been the one who called it finished. Because "I knew you'd come" was both the most generous thing his son could have said to him and the sentence that was going to live in his chest for a very long time. He put his arm around Joseph's back carefully, avoiding the broken ankle. "Hold on," Edwin said. "I have you." They heard the poacher's truck arrive at the trackhead before they had finished the extraction, the engine cutting out with the sudden quiet of a vehicle that has spotted something unexpected and decided to assess it. Whitfield was already on the satellite phone, voice flat and rapid, giving coordinates and situation to the KWS emergency line. She told Nadia, "Aerial unit ETA approximately 9 minutes. 9 minutes." Nadia walked to the space between the pit and the track and stood there. She did not pick up anything. She did not shout. She simply stood in the open ground with her arms slightly out from her sides, the posture she had learned in wildlife management training for standing in the presence of unpredictable animals. Present, visible, claiming the space without aggression, taking up more room than a person who is afraid. The poachers came around the far acacia line on foot, 2 men assessing. They saw Nadia. They saw the 2 trucks. They saw old Kamau standing on the Hilux's running board with a satellite radio extended skyward. Their eyes moved across the scene with the rapid calculation of people who have survived this long by knowing exactly when a situation has turned against them. And then they saw Old Tyr. The lion had followed them from the village. No one had noticed. He was simply there, seated on a low termite mound 30 meters to the east, in full view, watching with the complete and sovereign calm of an animal surveying territory that has always been and will always remain entirely his. The 2 men looked at each other. They walked back to their truck. The KWS aerial unit arrived 8 minutes and 40 seconds later. Joseph was airlifted to Nairobi. Stable vitals. Surgical repair to the ankle fracture. Clean break. Good alignment. The surgeon said he would walk without a limp. 3 days of monitored rehydration and observation. He would be home before the month ended. Edwin drove Nadia back toward Kamutha that evening without speaking much. The sky over the Mara had turned the color of a forge at that specific hour before dark, orange and iron and deep red at the horizon, the kind of sky that makes the land beneath it look small and temporary and very precious. The road was long and straight, cutting through the silver grass in a way that made it look like the only certainty in the landscape. Somewhere around the halfway point, Edwin said, "I should not have spoken the closing words." Nadia kept her eyes on the road ahead. "No," she said, "you shouldn't have. I believed—" He stopped, his hands adjusted on the wheel. "I was raised to understand that a man protects his family by not allowing hope to destroy them. I believed I was doing that. I believed that was what love required. I know what you believed, and you disagreed. I disagreed with every single day of it." She paused. The acacia trees moved past the window in the last of the light. "But I also understand why you believed it. That doesn't make me less angry, but I understand." That was as far as they went that evening. It was not resolution. It was not forgiveness. It was the beginning of the long, honest work that follows when a family has survived something that should have destroyed them. The work that has no ceremony, no closing prayer, no single moment in which everything is repaired. The work that is built slowly across meals and phone calls and the ordinary days when a person chooses again and again to stay in the conversation rather than step back from it. Joseph came home to Kamuthe in the second week of September. He walked with a slight catch in his right stride for the first few weeks, the ankle fully healed, structurally sound, but the body remembers what it has been through in ways that the medical report cannot quite capture. On his first week back in the field, Nadia was beside him. They were assisting Dr. Whitfield's team with a scheduled monitoring sweep when the telemetry equipment picked up Old Tier's collar signal in the northern range. The lion was due for a health check and collar refit. The sedation process was routine. Everything went as planned. Old Tier lay on his side in the amber grass, chest rising and falling with the deep, slow rhythm of sedated sleep. Up close, the scar across his muzzle was more intricate than it ever appeared at distance. Layers of old wounds over old wounds, a geography of encounters that had tested him and had not, across 11 years, managed to finish him. The ragged stub of his missing ear was smooth and long-heeled, almost tidy in its completeness. Nadia crouched beside the lion's face. She pressed 2 fingers against the ridge of his scar gently, the way a person touches something that has carried an enormous weight without ever understanding what it was carrying. She stayed like that for a long time. Dr. Whitfield noted in her field observation log that Old Tier's documented behavior of transporting foreign objects found within his territorial range was consistent with behavioral records from a 2019 field season. The function of such behavior in male lions remained a subject of genuine scientific debate. Territorial scent redistribution, cache practice, or something more complex that the field had not yet found the right language to describe. What was not subject to debate was the 13-day transport distance, or the specific location where the bag had been deposited, or what had been found inside it. An 11-year-old lion with a missing ear and a scarred face had carried a canvas satchel 6 kilometers through his territory and set it down in a human settlement he had every biological reason to avoid. He would never know what that meant. But in the headman's house in Kamutha, the photograph from Joseph's field journal, Joseph grinning at the wedding, Edwin's hand on his son's shoulder, their late mother caught mid-laugh, had been framed and hung on the wall beside the door. Not as a monument to the lion, as a reminder placed where Edwin would see it every time he left the house, of the thing a father almost lost when he confused acceptance with surrender. As a reminder that closing a door before its time is not the same as protecting the people on the other side of it. As a reminder that the people who love you most will sometimes stand at the fence line long after you have gone inside. Not out of foolishness, not out of denial, but because love does not always require proof to stay present. Sometimes it requires only the willingness to keep looking. The plains around Kamutha did not change. The acacia trees dropped their leaves in the dry season and grew them back when the rains returned. Old Tyr moved across his range as he had for 11 years, sovereign, scarred, entirely indifferent to the human stories he had set in motion. He hunted at night. He rested in the shade of the termite mounds. He marked the boundaries of a territory he understood completely and on his own terms. He would never know, but Nadia would remember the weight of his chest rising slowly beneath the sedation, the way his amber eye moved beneath its closed lid, chasing something in a lion's dream that no human would ever have access to, the way his scar felt against her fingers, ancient and resolved and still, somehow, warm. Still here, she thought, still here. There is a kind of grief that arrives before it is needed, the kind we reach for when hope becomes too expensive to carry. Edwin Odhiambo is not a villain in this story. He is a father who loved his family the only way he knew how, by absorbing the loss before it could break everyone else. Most of us have done the same, called it wisdom when it was really exhaustion. What a scarred lion carried into that village wasn't just a field bag. It was a quiet, unanswerable reminder. Some doors shouldn't be closed before their time. Joseph survived because his body refused to stop. Nadia kept searching because her love refused to become certainty. And an old lion with a torn face simply moved through his world, as lions always have, leaving a mark he never meant to leave. The wild doesn't know our grief schedules. It doesn't negotiate. It just keeps moving. And sometimes that's exactly what saves us. Which one would you have been, the one at the fence line or the one who spoke the closing words? Tell me below. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe. We have more of them every week.
If this story stayed with you, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear what you felt. Like the video and subscribe to Lion's Quiet Stories so you never miss the next one.